Have you ever imagined an entire army disappearing? Rome was the most powerful empire in the world, but in a dark forest, everything changed. 20,000 soldiers marched confidently and never returned. It was not just a defeat, it was a massacre. The humiliation was so great that Rome erased the destroyed legions from history. But how did this happen? How was the world's largest empire deceived and exterminated by warriors whom Rome considered inferior? In today's video, you'll discover how the Teutoburg Forest buried Roman pride and changed the course of history forever. The Romans believed that nothing could defeat them. His army was impeccable, disciplined soldiers, efficient tactics, and superior weapons. They had already conquered lands all over the known world, and Germania seemed to be just another addition to the empire. After all, who would dare to challenge Rome? The man in charge of transforming this savage land into another Roman province was Publius Quinctilius Varus, a skilled politician but without much military experience. He blindly trusted in Rome's strength and believed that the Germans could never pose a real threat. His mistake? Underestimating the enemy. Among the Germans there was a different man, Arminius. He grew up within the Roman army, learned its tactics, and won the trust of the generals. Officially, he was a loyal ally. In fact, he was waiting for the right moment to betray Rome and destroy the most powerful army in the world. And that chance came when Arminius suggested a shortcut through the dense Teutoburg Forest. He convinced Varro that this was the best way, and the commander did not hesitate. Without imagining that they were marching into a trap, the Romans entered the forest. It soon became clear that this was no ordinary territory. Giant trees blocked the sunlight, the terrain was wet, slippery, and the march became slower and slower. The soldiers, accustomed to advancing in rigid formations, were now stretched out in a disorganized line with no protection. But Varro was not worried. After all, Rome had always won. Then, all hell broke loose. Suddenly, spears flew out of the shadows. Screams of pain echoed. The Romans looked around and did not see the enemy. Arrows came from all sides, but from where? The forest seemed alive, swallowing its soldiers one by one. The Germans attacked and disappeared among the trees. The Romans tried to fight back, but there was no room to form their perfect ranks. His greatest tactical asset was now useless. Have you ever felt that the stories you know about Rome are always the same, without the real details, emotions, and strategies that defined the greatest empire in history? With that in mind, I created the 10 battles that shaped the empire. This book gets straight to the point. Clear, moving, and never-before-seen explanations of how legendary leaders turned battles into historic milestones. You no longer need to get lost in confusing reports. Click on the pinned comment and download now the 10 battles that shaped the Roman Empire. But beware, it is for a limited time. Transform the way you see history and discover what has always been missing in the narratives you thought you knew. Continuing the story, despair took over. The rain began to fall, turning the ground into a mud. The soldiers slipped, the carriages got stuck, the horses stalled. What was once a powerful army now looked like a group of lost men, aimless and with no chance of escape. For 3 days, the attacks continued. Each attempt at reorganization failed. Every move was anticipated by Arminius. The Roman army was crushed, without mercy. The few survivors tried to flee but were chased and killed one by one. When he realized that there was no way out, Varus preferred to take his own life rather than return to Rome as a loser. The pride that had blinded him was now pushing him to his death. When news of the massacre reached Rome, the empire was in shock. 3 legions had been erased from history. What once seemed impossible was now a reality. Rome had been humiliated, and Arminius, he became a legend among the Germans. The man who deceived Rome, destroyed its troops, and exposed its greatest weakness, pride. And so in the shadows of the Teutoburg Forest, the world's most powerful empire discovered that strength is not always enough to win a war. Before continuing, I saw here that you forgot to subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss all the content about Rome that we will always be bringing. Arminius was seen by the Romans as one of them. He wore his armor, spoke his language, and served in the imperial army. But none of this erased its true origins. He was a Germanic prince, and his land was being taken over by the most powerful empire in the world. Rome saw the Germans as savages in need of control, but what they called civilization was nothing but oppression. Forced tribute, total obedience, submission to Roman law. Arminius knew this reality well. He grew up within the Roman system, learned their tactics, fought alongside them, and he decided that he would use all this against them. Facing Rome head-on was impossible. The legions were disciplined, trained for war, and virtually invincible in the open. But what if they were drawn to a place where their training didn't work? The opportunity arose when Publius Quinctilius Varus, a governor more concerned with politics than war, took over Germania. For him, the region was already under control, and that's exactly what Arminius wanted him to believe. For months, he filled Varro with false information. He said that the tribes were pacified, that the Romans were respected, that there was no risk of revolts. Varro trusted him without hesitation. Meanwhile, Arminius was sowing secret alliances among the Germans. Once disunited, they now had a common goal: to drive Rome out. They just needed a plan. It was then that Arminius delivered the final blow. He warned Varro that a revolt was beginning and that they needed to act quickly. But to get to the place, they would have to cross the Teutoburg Forest. Varro, confident, took the bait without question. 3 whole legions marched into the forest, and it was exactly what Arminius wanted. Halfway through, he and his Germanic warriors asked permission to move away, supposedly to seek reinforcements. But in reality, they were taking their positions for the attack. When the Romans were in the heart of the forest, the trap closed. The attacks came from all sides. Spears cut through the air, arrows pierced the armor. But where were the enemies? The forest seemed alive. Each tree concealed Germanic warriors who attacked and disappeared into the darkness. The Romans attempted to regroup, but how to form their ranks within that chaos? They were cornered. The rain made everything worse. The ground turned to mud. The supply cars got stuck. The soldiers slipped, and the attacks continued, relentless. For 3 days, the Romans tried to resist. But how to fight an enemy who knew every inch of the terrain? In the end, the legions were completely wiped out. The few survivors were hunted down and killed. Varro realized that there was no escape. With no way out, he preferred to kill himself. Rome was in shock. 3 entire legions had been annihilated. The largest empire in the world was humiliated. And Arminius? He not only defeated the Romans, he destroyed them. With intelligence and strategy, the Germanic who was trained by Rome became the executioner of the empire. And he proved that sometimes war is not won with force. You win with cunning. Tell me here in the comments if you think Rome could have won this battle if it had another strategy. I want to know your opinion. They entered confidently. Varus led 20,000 Roman soldiers into the Teutoburg Forest, 3 whole legions, trained men, shining armor, banners raised. To them it was just another patrol, another barbarian uprising to be crushed. But Teutoburg was no ordinary battlefield. It was a dark and treacherous labyrinth. Giant trees blocked the sun, turning everything into darkness. The air was dense, laden with moisture and the smell of rotting leaves. The terrain was slippery, full of mud and hidden roots that made even the most experienced soldiers stumble. Then came the first mistake. The Romans were unbeatable in open terrain, where they could form their rigid ranks. But there, they were forced to march in a long line, stretched out, vulnerable. If they were attacked, they would not have time to react, and Arminius knew it. He watched them from the shadows. His plan was working. I just had to wait for the right moment. As the Romans advanced slowly, carrying heavy armor and supplies, the Germanic warriors were already in position, hidden among the trees, waiting to attack. Then the forest became silent. No birds, no wind, just the sound of armor creaking and boots sinking into the mud. The soldiers looked at each other, uneasily. Something was wrong. The war instinct of some veterans began to warn them, but it was too late. And then the first scream tore through the air. A spear appeared out of nowhere and pierced the chest of a legionary. Then another, and yet another. The massacre began. Arrows rained down from the trees. The Romans tried to protect themselves, but where did the enemies come from? They looked around and saw only forest. Then the Germans emerged from the shadows. They were fast. They attacked and disappeared. The Romans tried to counterattack, but the terrain was a nightmare. The mud trapped his feet. The trees impeded his movements. There was no way to defend himself properly. Varro shouted orders, but how to restructure an army in the midst of chaos? Then, the rain came. The soil has become a swamp. The soldiers stumbled, the horses stalled, the carts got stuck. Supplies fell into the mud, and weapons became too heavy to handle efficiently, and the attacks did not stop. Each attempt to escape led to new ambushes. Fear spread. The soldiers began to abandon their weapons, trying to flee in desperation. Many were chased and killed as they ran aimlessly, being shot down one by one. It was no longer a battle, it was a hunt. For 3 full days, the Romans were massacred. They were exhausted, hungry, wounded. Some tried to escape, but the forest swallowed them up. There was no way out. There was no hope. Varro realized that all was lost. He knew what happened to defeated generals. Rome did not forgive failures. He preferred to choose his own death rather than face shame, and he took his own life. When it was all over, 20,000 Romans were dead. The empire that was believed to be invincible was destroyed by an enemy it never considered a real threat. The Teutoburg Forest has become a tomb without tombstones, and Rome was never the same again. The first scream echoed before anyone understood what was happening. A spear flew out of the darkness and struck a soldier in the chest. He fell without even knowing where the blow came from. Then another, and yet another. Within seconds, the attack began. The Romans looked around, but saw no one. Shadows moved among the trees. Arrows pierced the air. Men fell one by one without even seeing the enemy. The soldiers tried to regroup, but there was no way to organize an army there. They were trapped, surrounded, defenseless. The whole forest seemed against them. The trunks blocked the view, the leaves muffled the sound, the mud trapped the feet. Each attempt at a counterattack failed. Each legionary overthrown was one more that the Germans did not have to face later. Varro shouted orders, but who could hear anything in the midst of the chaos? The legionaries were accustomed to clean, organized battles, but now they were fighting an invisible enemy. And then came the second attack. More spears, more arrows, more soldiers falling. Terror spread. Some tried to flee, but where? The forest was a deadly labyrinth. Those who ran to one side found another ambush. Those who retreated fell straight into a new trap. The Germans did not attack all at once. They surrounded small groups, isolated them, and exterminated them without giving them a chance to react. Each time a soldier saw his comrades falling, hope diminished. And then came the rain. The ground became a swamp. The soldiers slipped, the horses fell, the carts got stuck. The weight of the armor doubled. The shields were too heavy to lift. The swords were stuck in the mud. With each movement, the fatigue increased. Despair took over. Some began to throw their weapons on the ground. Others tried to run, but were hunted as helpless prey. Those who hid among the trees were found and killed one by one. For 3 days, the massacre continued. The soldiers were without food, without water, without strength to fight. They were being killed slowly, surrounded by enemies who showed no mercy. When they tried to sleep, they were attacked. When they tried to react, they were crushed. When they tried to flee, they found spears waiting for them. Rome had never seen a defeat like this. Those who tried to surrender were executed. Those who tried to escape were pursued and hunted down. Some knelt down and begged for their lives. They were not spared. What was once an army was now nothing more than a pile of bodies strewn across the mud and among the trees. Varus looked at what was left of his legions. The largest empire in the world was being decimated. He knew there was no way out. And then he realized hell was not ending. He was just getting started. With no alternatives, he chose his destiny, and he took his own life. And don't forget to pick up your digital book, 10 Battles That Shaped the Roman Empire. It's important that you get it right now before the units run out. Varro knew he was lost, but he couldn't just accept defeat. The army was in ruins, wounded men, exhausted, covered in mud and blood. The soggy ground held his feet, his armor was too heavy, his weapons slipped from his trembling hands. But they were still Roman soldiers. They still needed to fight. So he tried. He shouted orders, tried to reorganize the troops. They needed to resist. If they held the Germans long enough, perhaps they could flee when night fell. But there was no more cohesion. The army was broken, men scattered, desperate, not knowing where to go. The forest offered no refuge. The ground was pure mud. The trees blocked the view. The bodies piled up. There was no more discipline, only survival. Even so, some tried to fight. They dug trenches with their bare hands, tried to erect barricades with broken logs and shields, but it was useless. The Germans were not just winning, they were playing with them. The attack came again, fast, violent, relentless. The soldiers could no longer hold their weapons. Hunger, cold, and terror had consumed his strength. Each blow was slower, each defense weaker, and the Germans realized this. They were in no hurry. They approached slowly, striking and retreating, scaring, tired, hearing the Romans scream, savoring victory. The legionnaires who were still alive looked around and saw no way out. Some still tried to maintain formation, but their legs trembled. Their arms could barely raise their shields. They were no longer warriors. They were survivors waiting for death. Varro observed everything. There were no reinforcements. There was no help. Rome was not there. And then the soldiers began to give up. Some tried to run. They were chased and slaughtered. Others dropped their weapons and fell to their knees. They were killed without hesitation. The forest was littered with bodies. The empire that dominated the world was reduced to nothing in a few days. Varus knew what happened to defeated generals. He knew Rome. If he returned, he would be humiliated, accused, maybe executed. But to die at the hands of the Germans, that would not be his choice. He took a deep breath, looked at the few men who were still alive around him. Rome ended there. He knew that in a few hours, the Germans would invade the last stronghold of the survivors. They would be tortured, humiliated, and executed as trophies of war. He would not allow that. Then he fell on his own sword. The commander of 3 legions preferred death to shame. The Germans advanced and finished off what was left. The last Romans tried to fight, but it was futile. The massacre was complete. The sun began to set over the forest. The noise of the swords ceased. The smell of blood dominated the air, mixed with that of wet earth. The forest fell silent again. There was no one left to tell the story. Rome had been erased. The largest empire in the world had just suffered its worst defeat. Varro watched the destruction around him. The most powerful army in the world was now nothing more than a band of desperate men, covered in mud, blood, and terror. The Teutoburg Forest, which had previously seemed only an obstacle in the march, had become a cemetery. The cries of the Roman soldiers echoed through the trees, mingling with the noise of the rain and the sound of arrows cutting through the air. He knew there was no way out. What started as a control mission had turned into a death trap. His soldiers were being slaughtered one by one without any chance of reaction. The rigid formation of the legions, which so often ensured Rome's victory, was useless in that environment. There was no strategy. There was no refuge. The enemy attacked and disappeared before the legionnaires could fight back. Varro always believed in the strength of Rome. But now, in the face of the massacre, he realized that his confidence had been his undoing. He had fallen into Arminius's trap, blindly trusting a traitor. Now his only choice was the kind of death he would face. If he were captured by the Germans, his fate would be worse than death. He knew that he would be humiliated, dragged away like a trophy, used to show the Germanic people that Rome was not invincible. Perhaps he would be beaten to death, perhaps burned alive as an offering to the gods. But the most likely fate was slavery, an even more shameful end for a Roman general. He would never return home. Knowing this, he made his decision. He drew his sword, took a deep breath, and without hesitation, plunged it into his chest. The commander of 3 legions, a man who had once believed in the glory of Rome, was now just another body among thousands strewn across the muddy ground. His death would save no one, but at least he would have control over his own end. But the battle was not yet over. The Germans were in no hurry. They wanted to hunt down every survivor, exterminate what was left of the Roman legions. Those who tried to flee were persecuted and killed. Some begged for mercy, but there was no mercy for invaders. The screams were drowned out by the sound of blades cutting flesh, spears piercing armor. For the few who were captured, the suffering had only just begun. Many were taken to sacrificial rituals, their lives offered to the Germanic gods as thanks for the victory. Others were sentenced to slavery. Legionnaires who had once marched with pride were now treated as nothing. Some were forced to fight in makeshift arenas, just to entertain their captors before they died. The destruction was total. Varus's 3 legions ceased to exist. Rome, which had previously dominated lands and peoples with its military force, had just suffered a humiliating defeat. News of the catastrophe was slow to reach Rome, but when it did, the empire was in shock. Emperor Augustus, upon hearing the report, fell into despair. It is said that he spent days repeating the same phrase, "Varro, give me back my legions." But there was nothing to be returned. The bodies of the soldiers were left to rot in the forest. No burial, no tribute, no worthy memory of a once feared army. The Germans assured that Rome would never forget that defeat. Years later, when Rome finally had the courage to return to the site of the massacre, they found a terrifying scenario. The battlefield was still scarred by destruction. Bones strewn across the ground, broken shields, helmets buried in the mud. The forest had swallowed the remains of the legions, but the memory of the tragedy remained. Rome, which had prided itself on its victories and achievements, now had a wound that would never heal. The terror of the Teutoburg Forest would echo for generations. a reminder that even the world's most powerful empire was not invincible. The generals who came after learned their lesson. Never again would Rome underestimate its enemies in the same way. Never again would they send an army into Germany without first considering the true danger of that savage land. But none of this changed the past. Nothing would bring back the lost legions. Nothing would erase the humiliation of Varus, the annihilation of his soldiers, the glory that turned to dust. The Teutoburg Forest would remain as a tomb without tombstones, and Rome, despite its grandeur, would never be the same again. The news reached Rome as a blow impossible to accept. 3 entire legions had been destroyed. No reinforcement, no chance of retaliation, just silence. The largest empire in the world had just suffered its worst defeat. Emperor Augustus was paralyzed. When he understood the dimension of the tragedy, his mind collapsed. It is said that he walked around the palace repeating endlessly, "Varro, give me back my legions." But there were no legions to return. They had been erased from the map, from history, and later even from official records. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions ceased to exist. His numbers were never used again. No Roman soldier would ever carry these banners again. It was as if they had never existed. The tragedy was more than a military defeat. It was a blow to Rome's pride. Germania, which should have been another province of the empire, had become a symbol of terror. No general wanted to march again to those lands. No army dared to attempt to recover what was lost. But the Teutoburg Forest never let the memory of that defeat fade. What little was left of the army returned to Rome in amazement, unable to explain what it had experienced. No future victory was able to erase the fear imposed by the Germans. Years later, Rome decided to return to the site of the massacre. What they found left them speechless. Bones scattered on the floor, armor covered in moss, broken helmets, spear after spear stuck in the ground. No burial, no tribute, just the remnants of an army that disappeared. The Romans were accustomed to erecting cities on the ashes of their enemies. But there, they have not been able to plant a single flag. No fortress was built. No temple was erected. The forest had swallowed everything, as if the dead still belonged to that soil. Rome never again attempted to conquer Germania. The empire continued to conquer other lands, won wars, destroyed kingdoms, but nothing erased the trauma of defeat. Decades passed, new emperors ruled, but the scar of Teutoburg never disappeared. As much as Rome tried to forget, the fear of that forest never faded. The following legions knew the story and told legends about the night when the spirits of the soldiers were still screaming for help among the trees. Germania became a cursed territory, a reminder that Rome was not invincible. Decades later, a new expedition was sent to understand what happened. They found the battlefield exactly as it had been left. Scattered bones, rusty weapons, cracked skulls, and then they realized the truth. It was not just a military defeat, it was a warning. The Teutoburg Forest was not just a cemetery, it was a tomb of Roman arrogance. Varro's defeat was not just a military disaster, it changed the way Rome viewed its enemies. They would never again underestimate the barbarians. Never again would they march blind into uncharted territory. Roman strategy became more cautious, more careful, but the price of this lesson was too high. Augustus ordered that no one should talk about Teutoburg. The shame was too great, but silence did not erase the facts. It didn't change reality. Rome had been humiliated, and the worst, there was no one to blame but herself. Even with all the power it accumulated over the centuries, Rome never took revenge. Time passed, the emperors changed, but Germania remained intact. They knew that this forest was unforgiving, and even in the times of greatest glory, Rome knew that its greatest weakness still haunted its history. With each new emperor, this memory was present. Every time a general marched north, he felt the weight of those who never returned. The forest was waiting for them. He always waited, and as much as they tried to avoid it, Rome never escaped the shadow of its worst defeat. The Teutoburg Forest never let them forget. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was not just a defeat. It was a watershed for Rome. After that massacre, the empire realized that Germania would not be easily conquered. The dream of annexing those lands turned into a nightmare. The great Roman war machine had met an enemy it could not beat. Rome was known for bouncing back from defeats, but this time was different. The impact was so profound that the empire changed its military strategy. Instead of continuing to expand eastward, he decided to retreat. The Rhine became the definitive frontier. The plan to take Roman civilization to the depths of Germania was abandoned. If the Romans had won, the map of Europe might have been completely different. Latin culture could have dominated Germania, and perhaps the Germanic peoples would have been assimilated, as happened with the Gauls. But Teutoburg prevented that future. There, among damp trees and mud, Rome understood that its power was not absolute. From this battle, the Romans came to see Germania as a forbidden land. No Roman city was founded beyond the Rhine. No legion attempted to advance deep into barbarian territory. The trauma of this defeat caused Rome to shift its focus to strengthening its borders rather than expanding them. The empire began building fortifications, fortresses, and defensive roads to deter further invasions. Over time, the Germans grew stronger. In the future, they would be responsible for the final blow in Rome. Tribes such as the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, descendants of the same warriors who massacred Varus's legions, would invade and plunder the very heart of the empire. If Rome had conquered Germania, it could have changed its destiny. But the story took another turn. The Teutoburg Forest has become a symbol, a reminder that even the world's largest empire had its limits. The defeat not only marked the end of Roman expansion in that region, but also showed that Rome's power was not eternal. The impact of this battle was not restricted to the military field alone. Politically, the shock was so great that Rome began to treat its enemies with more caution. The cost of losing one legion was high, but losing 3 at once was a blow Rome had never experienced. This humiliation forced the empire to recognize that some lands were simply not worth the price of conquest. If the Romans had insisted on Germania, would the fate of the empire have been different? Perhaps a Romanized Germania would have created a barrier against the invasions that would come centuries later. But the story took another path. The empire survived for a few more centuries, but when it fell, it was the descendants of those same Germanic warriors who destroyed its walls. Rome never forgot Teutoburg. Even as the empire reached its height, the shadows of that forest still hung over its decisions. The echo of defeat never disappeared. No legion marched again with the numbers erased from history. No attempt at revenge was successful, and so the Teutoburg Forest became more than a battlefield. It has become a symbol of the fragility of power, a reminder that even the greatest empires have limits. Rome thought that nothing could stop it, but in Teutoburg, it found its limit. 20,000 soldiers marched to their deaths. The humiliation was so great that they erased the destroyed legions from history. They never again tried to conquer Germany. Centuries later, the descendants of these warriors destroyed the empire. The worst Roman defeat changed everything and rewrote the future of Europe once and for all. And remember, whenever you want to know how Rome became the largest empire in antiquity, just go to the pinned comment and get your digital book, The 10 Battles That Shaped the Roman Empire. Get it right now because the units are limited. And you, did you already know this battle? If you like epic content, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. It helps me bring more amazing stories to you. See you in the next video.